Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of Big Ideas webinars. I'm Sarah Curitan, Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and I'm delighted to see all of you here. The Commission is an agency in the New Jersey Department of State under the leadership of Secretary of State Tahisha Way. This series of programs is one part of our effort to get lots of conversations started about history, especially the American Revolution, and how it relates to all of us today. You will find many more resources to delve into this topic on our website, history.nj.gov. And all of this is part of our larger initiative, Revolution NJ, New Jersey's commemoration of the upcoming 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. We're proud to be working on this project in partnership with the crossroads of the American Revolution. Now, in this particular series, we really strive to tackle the big ideas that confront all of us as we seek to understand ourselves, our neighbors, and our communities better. And today's topic is certainly a big one, identity. To get us started, I'm delighted to hand the program over to our program coordinator, Dr. Mark Lawrence. Mark?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our second Big Ideas Concepts for the 250th panel session. This series of panel sessions specifically explores questions and approaches to topics that may seem familiar at the surface level, but are much deeper and expansive once we start diving into them. We ask folks joining us today to keep an open mind and to approach these ideas with the sense of critical inquiry. Today's discussion aims to provide approaches and perspectives that can be applied to various settings. Whether it is a teacher trying to grapple with the complexity of identity in the classroom, or a historic site exploring ways their programming can connect to the everyday experiences of visitors. Our discussion today explores ways in which identity is constructed, experienced, and grappled with, and why that is important. Coming from an anthropological background, I was fascinated learning about identity. And the different ways humans come to understand their own identities and the ways in which they differentiate themselves from others. Most importantly, I found myself diving into the questions of why these processes occur and what is at stake when we create the quote unquote other. I hope that, this type of inquiry and diving into this concept is going to be something that you take seriously and go down a similar path of inquiry and discovery, trying to really look at identity today less as like a checklist of traits and more about a complex navigation of ideas, expectations, cultural norms, and power dynamics. We will save a lot of time at the end, about 15 minutes for discussion to answer any questions folks might have. And we really urge people to leave questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end. I'd like to also just say a special thank you to the staff at the New Jersey Historical Commission and at the Crossroads of the American Revolution, our partners for Revolution NJ, especially Chris Myers for helping coordinate today's session and Greer Luce for helping with creating the promotional material. With that being said, I am honored to introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Jessie Bayker. Dr. Jessie Bayker is the Research Project Manager and Digital Archivist at the New Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. He is a scholar of gender, sexuality, and African American history in New Jersey. He curates the Scarlet and Black Digital Archive, which uses historical primary sources to shed light on the legacy of slavery and dispossession at Rutgers University. Dr. Bayker is writing a book about transgender lives and practices in 19th century America. His article, Some Very Queer Couples, Gender Migrants and Intimacy in 19th Century America, appeared in the journal Gender and History. His chapter, Regulating Public Gender and the Rise of Cross-Dressing Laws, is forthcoming in the Cambridge History of Sexuality in the United States, co-edited by Jen Mannion and Nick Surratt. He holds a PhD in history from Rutgers University and a BA in history and LGBTQ studies from Brooklyn College. Please welcome Dr. Jessie Bayker.
Thank you so much, Mark. And now I would like to introduce our panelists for the day and invite them to come on the screen with us. So first we have Dr. Rachel Watkins. Dr. Rachel Watkins is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at American University. Dr. Watkins is a biocultural anthropologist with an emphasis on African-American biohistory and social history, also in bioanthropological research practices and histories of biological anthropology in the United States. She was initially trained as in skeletal biology, and her work focused on looking at relationships between health, disease, and social location in people whose remains are in the W. Montague Cobb Anatomical Collection and interred at the New York African Burial Ground. This research led to a broader interest in how African-American skeletal remains and living populations were centered in the development of research practices and racial formation in US biological anthropology. Her current projects continue to draw on intellectual and political work tied to Cobb and his laboratory from 1932 to the present, as sites for understanding science as a social practice through a Black feminist lens. So welcome, Dr. Watkins. Also joining us today, we have Dr. Svati Shah. And Dr. Svati Shah is an anthropologist who works on questions of sexuality, gender, migration, and caste capitalism in India. They have been at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst since 2009, and they currently serve as Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Dr. Shah also holds adjunct appointments in the departments of Anthropology and Afro-American Studies, and is affiliated with the Asian American Studies program and the Social Thought and Political Economy program at UMass. Their first book, Street Corner Secrets, Sex, Work, and Migration in the City of Mumbai, was published in 2014 by Duke University Press and by Orient Black Swan in India. That book discussed sex work as an aspect of labor migration that is mediated by the politics of space, urbanization, and caste. Dr. Shah is currently working on a book based on long-term ethnographic research on the shifting political landscapes of queer and transgender social movements and the rise of authoritarianism in India. Welcome, Dr. Shah. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll get right into talking about identity and trying to figure out what it is. And to situate us in this conversation, I first want to ask each of you, from your perspective, well, we'll start with Dr. Watkins, from your perspective as a biocultural anthropologist, what is identity?
First of all, thanks so much for having me be a part of this discussion. I'm looking forward to it. So what is identity? Identity is, first and foremost, a socially constructed way of putting people into categories with an investment in making a particular type of sense of how and why we're different. And while these ways of categorizing people and identifying people seem very natural to us, that the assumptions and the ways in which we think we see a particular type of person by way of how they look or how they sound is something that we academics like to say is ideological, meaning it's a part of how this kind of taken for granted way of knowing the world is ingrained within us. And a lot of the work that we do as academics is around taking, all sorts of wonderfully deep and esoteric vibes, pathways to looking at how that taken for granted knowledge is developed and shared and how it sticks around. And these discussions are great for demonstrating how, a lot of our work that is seemingly esoteric really has a lot to do with thinking through and working through ideas like identity very broadly and specific aspects of identity, race, gender, sexual orientation, physical ability, neurotypicality, all of these sorts of things. So that is my answer about what identity is.
Thank you. So Dr. Shah, same question for you as an anthropologist, from your perspective as an anthropologist, what is identity to you in your work?
I mean, I think that's such a beautiful definition. I wouldn't want to, I have nothing to add to it really. The only thing I might say alongside that definition is that identity, if we accept that definition of identity, then we also accept that identity changes historically, it changes over time, and it changes in very profound ways. So we take categories like race, gender, sexuality, class as naturalized categories in our time. And if we look at the historical record, the long historical record, like if we go to the Paleolithic period, which is a kind of historical perspective that anthropologists can indulge in because we think about things like archaeological remains and fossilized bones and fossils at the bottom of oceans and things like that, kind of geological time. In the Paleolithic period, there was probably no such thing as race in the way that we experience it today. So as an anthropologist, I take those kinds of changes very seriously, and I sort of assimilate them along with Dr. Watkins' definition with that lens to understand that although in a human lifetime or even in a human historical era, it may seem like these categories of difference are unchanged and natural, they actually do change over time, which is why we emphasize the power of the social and the power of the historical and the economic and the political in how we understand identities. One thing that I often end up needing to clarify with my students that might be helpful here is if we say identity is socially and historically mediated, we are not saying identity is not real. We are saying that the terms of the realness of identity are not strictly biological or natural, that we're trying to unpack what those discourses of biology and nature are actually saying and where they're coming from.
Great. Thank you so much for those definitions to get us started. We're talking about the way that identity is socially and historically mediated, as you said. So I'd like us to get into this question of who gets to determine someone's identity? What are the internal and external forces that push individuals to self-identify in a certain way? And what is at stake here with those forces? Dr. Shah, do you want to jump into that question first?
Sure, I was really looking forward to Dr. Watkins' answer on that, so I'll keep my comment very brief. So I started mentioning some of the external, if you want to call it that, forces, laws, policies, economies, things that sort of seem like they exceed the individual person, although we also know from certain theoretical interventions that were made in the 60s and 70s that we also kind of internalize those discourses in ourselves. So it's difficult for me to say that these things are necessarily external per se, but for the moment, let's pretend that there are external and internal forces. I would say that there are things like laws, policies, economies that shape and mediate and indeed define identities. There's wonderful work by a sociologist named Dorothy Roberts, who wrote a book called Fatal Invention, who talks a lot about the role of biomedicine in producing race in extremely violent and historically persistent ways. So there are those kinds of forces. And then there are also what I might, for the sake of our discussion, call internal forces, things like affinities, community, love, affection, family. There are ways that people also deeply and positively identify with the communities that they're part of, be they based in race, ethnicity, language, culture, another term that's been very vexing for anthropologists and has been used in very negative ways, but also in very affirming ways. So I think that there is a kind of dialogue or a dialogic dynamic between these forces, if you will, and the ways that people sort of take up these discourses and understand themselves within them over the course of their lives.
Picking up on one of the important points that Dr. Shah made in their previous comments, I want to return to the power of the historical and the power of the social and how that factors into a broad range of academic work. The ways in which the stakes in identity and identifying a particular way or being identified in a particular way have everything to do with history and how certain relationships between people in terms of power dynamics, someone being subjugated, one group of people being subjugated by another group of people, has everything to do with the current stakes of humanity today. Using my work as an example, one of the things that I'm looking at as a biological anthropologist now is how these very Western ways of thinking, Western science, has everything to do with how we make sense of the world and order the world and categorize people and make sense of human differences in ways that are reliant upon hierarchies, in ways that are reliant upon capitalism, all of these social forces that play a role in our daily lives today. And there is an aspect to that that absolutely involves the agency that people take on in terms of identifying in particular ways, like Dr. Shah said, around affinity groups and what have you. And then there's also the historical piece in terms of how this kind of social dynamic was created in which it was okay to determine someone else's identity based on whether you were in a group that possessed a lot of power over another group. The stakes also are related to the fact that since that particular way of knowing people and identifying people is normalized, it seems like it's second nature, like it has to be a part of how we understand human beings and how they interact and how we're different. You run the risk of, as we academics say, not being legible, not being visible, if you are not willing to be identified, not in the way that you identify as part of an affinity group, but if you completely resist identification that's tied to the history of how we have come to know and shape the world in that very dominant way. And so I think this is where, and this is where my colleagues, Dr. Bayker and Dr. Shah are much more well-versed in this, much more versed in this. This is where issues of citizenship come up as it's tied to identity, how one self-identifies and how somebody is identified. And then there's also for our teachers who are in the audience or who will see this, one of the things that I, as a professor, talk about is the history of scientific racism and the role that Western science has played in making these identities real, that there is empirical evidence of different races and different abilities, and that gender is something that is fixed, that sex is something that's either male or female. I teach about the role that science has played in creating what are really, in a matter of speaking, alternative facts around people's lived experiences that don't really mesh with what's actually going on and how people are living and being.
So one thing that I'm hearing that's coming up in this conversation is that this idea of history and the importance of history. When we look at identity today and we ask how does a person identify today or how they identified, we have to understand how the past has brought us to this present moment, like the history of scientific racism. How has that shaped the way that people understand what is race and their racial identity today? But one thing that I'll ask you to also comment on is identity a productive lens to use in exploring the past? So when we're talking about people who lived in the past, maybe 250 years ago, we're coming up on our revolutionary celebrations in New Jersey, and not only celebrations, but rethinking about some of the stories that we tell about that time period. Can you comment on what we need to be thinking about when we're looking at the past, looking at people in the past, and should we be thinking about identity? Is that the most useful way to be framing our questions about the past?
I'll start briefly. I think that my answer would be yes and no, leaning toward the no. Understanding that identity is in large part the way that people are known and categorized collectively. I think that when we're kind of talking about the interface between academic research and how we engage with the public around our research, it's important to address the assumed reality of identity. But that doesn't mean that we have to maintain that language or framework for looking at the different ways, different lived experiences. And so one of the things that we really like to emphasize in our academic work as anthropologists and people who study issues of race, gender, sexuality, ability, the whole gamut, is to pluralize these terms that we typically speak to in the singular. So instead of identity, we talk about identities. In terms of Black scholarship, that's where the term you might be familiar with, intersectionality, came from. And to talk about the lived experiences initially of Black women in a way that didn't just maintain this static way of seeing Black women as just Black and women, but thinking about all the parts of our lived experience that span gender, sexuality, ability, neurotypicality, class, all of these things. So that's why I say yes and no. And I think that once in discussions we establish the construction of identity, then it's possible to continue and build on that discussion in a way that does not center identity, in a way that reproduces the truth of these categories that don't really exist.
Yeah, I think, gosh, there's so much to say about that question, actually. I'm trying to keep myself succinct here. So I think in addition to what Dr. Watkins just shared, I would add that if we think about what was happening 250 years ago, let's just go back for a minute to the mid to the late 18th century in Europe. When Dr. Watkins uses the term Western, I think about that time as the beginning of the version of the West that we recognize today. And why do I say that? Because that is when the Scottish Enlightenment is happening. That is when Adam Smith and Hobbes and Locke are writing their very foundational for the modern era treatises. That's just the beginnings of the stirrings of industrial capitalism and the kind of end of the kind of centuries of commercial capitalism that had preceded it. So in a lot of ways, when we talk about identity in our own time, we are talking about categories that emerged in the wake of and really in conjunction with industrialization and the kind of modern era that elicited. Now, I think that's important because if we take this long historical view, we may even start to ask whether people in the early 18th century in Europe and certainly in other parts of the world, I work on South Asia, I have colleagues who work on Southern Africa, you know, these places, did they use the concept of identity or a concept of individualism that kind of supports and promotes the concept of identity? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think they thought of themselves differently. And certainly people in feudal Europe, did they have identities? Did people identify as serfs? Or was that just what they were because God told them that that's what they were? You know, like that there are different ways that people understand their physical selves in relation to the world that they inhabit. Identity is our way of understanding our relationship to the physical world, but identity itself has a very interesting and intricate history that I think can't be uncoupled from the history of capitalism. So when you ask that and you ask about the origins of the United States, I think we have to think about that history as well.
So I want to remind our audience that we will have time for Q&A today. So in order to ask a question to one of our panelists, just go into the Q&A box that you see on Zoom and you can type in your question there and we'll address that. So start thinking of your questions. But for now, I still have a couple more questions for our panelists. Can you please comment on the role of social theory in understanding identity, and how does the theoretical work translate into everyday life?
So I think one thing that we're seeing now is a mobilization of identity in a very close relationship with discourses of nationalism. And that hasn't always been bad, right? People have mobilized identity in the context of nationalist discourses in positive ways in the United States and in very radical ways. So that in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem, but it does become a problem when a majority or a majoritarian group starts to mobilize a discourse of identity in relation to a discourse of a nation and naturalizing both of those things. So we're kind of seeing this in the United States, in Belarus, in India, where these kind of majority publics are mobilizing the concept of nationalism in relation to their own identity and in relation to history. So to kind of say, well, we were here, we were always here, this is our land, and it was never anybody else's land. And if it was, they were interlopers because we have a natural birthright to be here, and therefore we have a right to expel, eliminate, kill anybody that we think doesn't belong here. So unfortunately, we are living through a time when the stakes of this conversation are very high, and the stakes of this conversation are absolutely running through a historical narrative. So I think it's very important for us to understand that when we are talking about identity, especially right now, we are also having to think about categories of nation and of the uses of history.
Thank you for that. The one thing I guess I will add to their comments is that in large part, academics or researchers, anybody who's doing research really uses theory as a tool to understand the kind of foundational ideas that are shaping things like what we're talking about now, identity. And understanding those foundational ideas in the context of history, as well as how history is connected to the present. And I think one of the threads that runs through my work and Dr. Shah's work is kind of looking at particular spheres where the very Western traditional notion of identity or the very binary ways of thinking that come out of the Western Enlightenment that Dr. Shah mentioned, the binaries that really kind of shape our traditional ways of thinking about human categories and human differences, kind of stick around and maintain. And we use theory to show how these different spheres that are treated separately are actually intertwined and all a part of a broader project around reinforcing particular ways of normalizing certain human interactions in terms of power, in terms of distributing resources differently, and it looking like that distribution is normal when it actually isn't. So theory is a tool, and it's a tool that we can all use. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that manifests in the very academic or jargony language that we use in our communication with our colleagues, but it is also showing up in everyday conversation in public and other spheres. And that's also a really useful way to use theory as a tool as well, is to demonstrate the connections between these broader kind of public conversations about these things and the academic conversations.
So I want to remind our audience that, again, to go ahead and put your question in the Q&A, because that's what we're going to be doing next. And before we do that, I just want to open up a space for both our panelists to comment on any of the key takeaways that you think people should have in mind related to these themes that we're talking about today as they move forward in planning for the 250th anniversary of the revolution in New Jersey.
I suppose a key takeaway, given that we're speaking here hosted by the New Jersey Historical Commission, is that history matters. It is not just something that describes pre-existing processes and dynamics. We are also able to produce things via historical narratives, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. Another takeaway I might offer is within the practice of history, there's something called presentism, and presentism is bad. And presentism means projecting a category from the present as if it existed throughout time. So there are times when the category of identity itself or particular identity-related categories are projected onto the past in ways that are not supported by the data. So when I say race was not something that existed throughout time, I don't mean that human beings did not have different skin colors and hair textures and facial features. What I mean is the ways in which race is used to categorize people did not always exist. So when we say things like, we talk about the invention of race or the invention of sexuality or the invention of gender, what we are making a statement about history. We're not making a statement about biology or about the physical human body. We understand that human beings come in all shapes and sizes and colors. But what we're saying is that the categories are not timeless. And I think that is about being true to the data. And it is also a very deeply political statement. And in this time and place, both of those things need to be thought about together. So I think that for me would be the main takeaway from this.
Thanks so much for that. I think that because Dr. Shah spoke so well to the historical piece and kind of wrapping things up in terms of how, the importance of thinking about these issues around identity in the context of history and politics. What I will say is more on the interpretive side. So, we're not people who are charged with the responsibility of interpreting history in a way that lends to celebrating this 250th anniversary and making this information broadly accessible. So I think one takeaway to keep in mind is that, of course, identity and issues of identity are really, really complex and really messy. And so when it comes to interpretation, especially that for a broad public, it's very important to make decisions and to be intentional about how you want to present that messiness. Because if you kind of present the totality of the complexity, it's really difficult to reach the broadest possible audience. So there is a manner of decision-making and packaging around certain ideas that needs to be an important part of it, but in a way that does not lend to helping to reproduce the reality of these ideas that have not, as Dr. Shah said, been around since the beginning of time. There are ways to do that that do not reinforce those ideas. And that's why I'm really grateful for this conversation and your organization's willingness to have these sorts of conversations, because organizations and people aren't always creating space for that. So thank you.
So it's time for our audience Q&A, and I'll also invite Mark Lorenk to come back on the screen to help us field the questions. And I'll start us up with this first question here that comes from an anonymous asker. So thank you, anonymous audience attendee. So this comment here says, thank you for providing us with ways of thinking about and deconstructing the Western structures that drive many of our modern interpretations of the American past. Are there some examples from your own work or from the work of others of reapproaching identity through a historical interpretation for a public audience?
So there are a couple of dimensions to the work that I do around my historical study of scientific practices and biological anthropology, as well as being a practitioner of sorts. So, and again, getting back to the messiness and complexity, while my work might involve skeletal biology, as well as historical research, as well as whatever else, there might be a case where if I'm working with communities around public education and historical interpretation, I'm not necessarily involved as a skeletal biologist. I'm involved as somebody with experience with what we usually call descendant community engagement. And so, gosh, my thought flew totally out of my head. Can you ask the question again?
Sure. So the question is about just examples that you could share from your own work or others' works of how people reapproach identity through a historical interpretation for a public audience.
Exactly. Yes. So thanks. Sorry about that. So one of the ways it's really important is to bring together, in terms of history, a constituency of people, different constituencies who always haven't been involved or been able to be involved in interpreting their own experience. And so a lot of my work around descendant community engagement has to do with not coming in as an academic and kind of imposing some particular way of thinking about these complexities around identity, but actually bringing the community's understanding of that into the conversation and the way that history is interpreted and disseminated to the public, because as we've all mentioned previously, there's theory in that. There are demonstrations of knowing how the world is actually creating and making up categories to speak to people's lived experiences that have nothing to do with them. They have everything to do with who's in power being able to set the tone for those things. And so that's an important part of my work, is kind of what we call democratizing the way that we develop knowledge and how we share that knowledge about history.
Thank you. Yeah.
I guess I would just add briefly to that, if I'm understanding the question right, are there ways to talk about this in a broad way to a non-specialist audience? And I think that there are many ways to do that. For example, the book that I cited, Fatal Invention, Dorothy Roberts has a wonderful TED talk that's on YouTube where she explains very clearly what the book is about. There are lots of ways that archaeology is now embracing transgender and feminist perspectives on interpreting categories like gender and sex in the archaeological record. I think for a wider audience, some of those debates are very fun and very relatable. You know, how do you know that a skeleton is a big, strong, burly warrior or a diminutive, petite homemaker? You can't. And archaeologists are having a big, huge debate about it. So I think anything that sort of draws people into some of those discussions would be very, very worthwhile. One thing I'll say about those is, you know, I was thinking what would be like the most succinct way I would describe my goal for engaging in this conversation today for our audience. And I think one of my goals was to sow doubt and confusion and questions, right? We have a kind of an idea that these identity categories are fixed, which means if we look at an old skeleton, we can know who it was, what gender, what race, what sexuality. And in truth, we can't, because that's really how science works. There's lots of open-ended questions. There's lots of new questions to ask. So I think in the process of this, if people come away feeling that we know less than we think we know, then we're going to get somewhere.
Great. So this next question is from Anita Falvo, and this really takes us into the realm of talking about schools and working with students. And so the question is, how do you suggest that we talk to high school students about the role of identity in the past? Anita Falvo gives this example from the classroom that maybe we could think about. She says, for instance, I'm currently teaching the mid-1800s in America during the industrial and transportation revolutions, while also looking at social reforms. So we touch on the beginning of the feminist movement, abolitionism, treatment of the disabled, of immigrants, especially Irish, class conflict, and other things of that nature. So how do we get our students to understand how society felt about these quote unquote categories of people, while also seeing how they integrated into society? And I'll throw out there also, Anita Falvo had asked a related question separately here about how do we also help history teachers themselves to recognize their own identities as well as their students, and how it influences their teaching and learning. So really kind of thinking about the actual, you know, what do we do when we're standing in front of the classroom with our students, and how do we address this in the identity in the past, but also how do we work with our colleagues and bring them on board with this conversation.
Dr. Shah, I think it's your turn to go first. Is it? I think.
Sure. So as you all know, I'm an anthropologist who works in South Asia. So whenever I am thinking about a period like the period that you described, the mid 1800s, I'm thinking about the ways that things that were happening in the kind of settler colonial space of what would become America, the America we know. I am thinking about how that space was connected with other spaces. So for example, when I think about slavery and cotton production in the Americas, I also am thinking about the international cotton market. And I'm also thinking about the place that that crop was sent to be made into garments and what the market for those garments was. The part of the market for those garments was in South Asia. And after the Civil War, India became a very important cotton producer because access to enslaved labor and extremely cheap cotton crop changed because of the anti-slavery movements and uprisings in the United States. So I think for history teachers, there's a lot of opportunity to talk about economic processes, certainly, but I also think there's an opportunity to kind of talk about the world as extremely connected, because the world has always been very, very connected. If it wasn't, we wouldn't have had human migration to literally every corner of the planet. Before the modern era, human beings lived on every form of habitable land in the world. We did not all evolve in Europe or in what became Alaska or even in South Asia. The fossil record is in Africa. So we migrated, right? And that means that we've always kind of been, the world has always been very connected by routes of travel and migration and the economy. So I think as somebody who's from the United States and works on South Asia, I would love to see thinking about that period that you describe in very expansive and connected ways. The other thing I would say is in thinking about the contiguous United States, and what people in Hawaii call mainland, the mainland, there were lots of indigenous communities in the United States, in what became the United States then, as indeed there are now, that did not have the same identity categories that emerge from Western Europe. So I also think there is a lot of opportunity to kind of complicate some of those narratives in ways that I think students of all stages would connect with.
Absolutely. I would just echo that. And that was going to be my suggestion, to shift the framework from one that is US centered to one that is globally centered, because there's a tendency, for instance, to think about race in very US specific terms, as if it's something that is not a part of identity construction outside of the US. There are absolutely very US specific elements of constructing race, as is the case in other countries, but the ideas, the ingredients, if you will, we have an anthropologist who writes about the history of race in the United States, and she talks about these, what she calls pre-racial ingredients, that have to do with the ways in which difference was thought of previously, not in a racial context, but differences that were associated with the particular types of social organization that led to some people being in groups and out groups and what have you. Those ideas, those ingredients are not from the US. Those ingredients are from all over the place. And if that's not something that's emphasized to students, then it's very difficult for students and for us to understand identity in very complex global terms. So I think that's important. And along with that, I think that there are real opportunities in the classroom to do case studies where that can be emphasized. So especially during this time period, to do a kind of focused reading on how Irish people were identified and how they identified themselves. A lot of students and still a lot of adults do not know that the Irish were not always considered to be white, that being Jewish was not a part of being white. And so if we look at the social and the political and economic shifts that are tied to how people are identified, and how, as Dr. Shah mentioned previously, how identity changes over time, that also helps to clarify things. To, oh, okay, let's look at the process by which Irish people went from being thought of as, in terms of their interactions and conflicts with the English, as savages, to being white in the United States. And you will have to draw on those economic and political processes that Dr. Shah mentioned to make sense of that.
Thank you. I want to flag for our audience that if you're not looking in the chat, take a look in the chat, because some of the resources and books being mentioned by our panelists are posted in the chat with some links, so you can have access to that.
Can I mention just a couple more books? I forgot to mention, I think it's broadly used in education, but The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould is a very useful kind of introductory text around these things. There's a train, as well as a book titled Ebony and Ivy. And I think that's a very useful book for kind of how to look at the complexities of how all this stuff is tied together: capitalism, enslavement, the Enlightenment, scientific racism. It's a very a good book for that. And in both cases, there are indeed lectures, YouTube interviews. There's one with the author of Ebony and Ivy that was done on Democracy Now! That's only like 15 minutes. That would be really useful. We understand we all don't have time to read a bunch of books. So I wanted to make sure to mention those.
I will also add that I'm not aware of a book that describes the international cotton trade in the way that I have just mentioned, but a book that does that with sugar is called Sweetness and Power by an anthropologist named Sydney Mintz, who does it's a beautiful kind of classic of kind of an anthropologist who's thinking about the history of sugar and the ways that sugar connected the world and the ways that a market for sugar was created in Britain and then in Europe. So that's also a wonderful book to teach from, and many summaries and videos about it are available online.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those resources with our audience. And we have time for one more question. So I'm going to pose a question from our audience from Stacy Roth, who is asking about historical sites. Stacy's question is, at many historic sites, the desire for authenticity, quote unquote, authenticity in historical clothing and gender roles, race, etc., has led to a limitation of who can work at these sites, who gets to tell the stories with this kind of interpretive work. So with the 250th anniversary of our nation approaching, how can we change the algorithm of participation to be more accepting of interpreters who are not the modern counterpart to the lives of events that they are interpreting?
Yeah, I think a quick answer, knowing we're running out of time, is to review the trajectory of the New York African burial ground, the Manhattan burial ground, which I am assuming in your parts is well known, because some of these very issues 30 years ago came up that, well, this is a site that is focused on enslavement, African descendant people. Is it the case that only African descendant people can work on this? To which we often replied, there aren't enough people of color and African descendant people who are allowed to be part of the conversation to even raise that question. So again, going back to the important point that Dr. Shah made about the importance of history, we have to think about why there are at times priorities around making sure that people who are perhaps descended or culturally associated, affiliated with the groups being interpreted are playing a role in that. There's a way that history is being redressed appropriately in terms of, including these folks in interpretation. And again, there's videos and things about the New York African burial ground that I think will be really helpful in providing context.
I would just quickly add that, and alongside what Dr. Watkins has just said, I think there are other sort of sites like Colonial Williamsburg where this has come up, because there's been this idea that, it should only be white reenactors of those roles. And I think, if you look at London in that period, if you look at Williamsburg in that period, it was, but from our perspective, we would see those places as incredibly diverse. So I also think it's about, if I take Dr. Watkins' point, I think it's about being historically accurate. And if we look at the historical record, it's much more diverse, it's much more interesting, it's much more textured than I think we give it credit for.
Thank you so much to our panelists. So I would like to give them a virtual round of applause. We're running up on the 1 o'clock, so I think we're going to stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us for this. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much.
And thank you, everyone. Today, everyone did an amazing job. Thank you so much, Dr. Bayker, Dr. Watkins, and Dr. Shah. We were super excited to have this panel, and I'm hoping that folks dive into the resources that you shared with us, and we'll be sending that around to folks too, for anyone who registered today, so that they can take a look at those links. I'm going to pass it off to Chris, who's going to set up our upcoming events slide, and folks can take a look at what we have coming up. The third panel session we have planned for next March, which is looking at how society shapes individual actions. So if you found today interesting, we're just going to keep building on that. And we're hoping to get folks excited on exploring some of these larger concepts. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of the day